I want to give a quick summary of Chapter 2 from Bart Ehrmans' book, Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth. Chapter 2 is titled Non-Christian Sources for the Life of Jesus. On page 37, here's a quote from Bart. Even though there are innumerable historical problems in the New Testament, they are not of the scope or character to call seriously into doubt the existence of Jesus. So Bart admits there are innumerable historical problems with the New Testament, and he rejects the miracle-working Jesus. But he still holds that there was a regular man who didn't perform any miracles. Bart says on page 38, technically, we cannot prove a single thing historically. So Bart knows he can't prove Jesus exists. He just asserts that he did after he discredits the sources that talk about him. On page 39, Bart talks about the kind of sources that historians want. And he says, first, the real preference is for hard physical evidence, like photographs. But we don't have that for Jesus. Page 40, in addition to physical evidence, we look for surviving products that can be traced with relative certainty back to the person. But we don't have that for Jesus. Page 40, finally, historians look to other kinds of evidence, not from the person, but about the person, and this is what is most common. And historians prefer to have lots of written stories, not just one or two, the more, obviously, the better. Page 41. Historians also prefer to have sources that are relatively near the date of the person or event they are describing. Historians would like to have contemporaneous, but we often don't have that, so the closer you can get to when the actual event happened, the better. But we don't have any contemporaneous records of Jesus, and Bart is destroying the credibility of the sources that we do have for Jesus in this book. Page 41. If all you have is a mere mention of a person's name in a source, that is not nearly as good as having long, extensive stories told in lots of ancient sources. Moreover, it is obviously best if these extensive stories are reported in sources that are disinterested. In other words, not highly biased toward the subject matter. And if someone is biased toward the subject matter, the bias has to be taken into account. So when we read the Bible, we have to understand that it's biased toward Jesus being a miracle man. Page 42. And if we find out that one author derived their information from another, then you no longer have multiple sources, but only one. Their agreements do not represent corroboration, but collaboration, and that is much less useful. And that's what we have in the four gospel accounts. Collaboration. They're not independent sources. They know about each other, and they're updating the story based on what was written before. In short, if a historian were drawing up a wish list of sources for an ancient person, she would want a large number of sources that derive from near the time of the person they discuss. They are extensive in what they have to say about that person, and they are disinterested to some extent in what they say, and that corroborate one another's accounts without having collaborated. This is not what we have from the Bible, and Bart goes on to open a whole new category, saying the sources for Jesus, what we do not have. So he's going to say we don't have this information for Jesus. On page 42, Bart says there is no hard physical evidence for Jesus, including no archaeological evidence of any kind. On page 43, he says we also do not have any writings of Jesus. Also on page 43, he says we have no Greek or Roman author from the 1st century that mentions Jesus. On page 46, Bart talks about eyewitnesses, and he says, I need to stress that we do not have a single reference to Jesus by anyone, pagan, Jew, or Christian, who was a contemporary eyewitness. He says, even though it was once thought that Matthew and John were eyewitness testimonies, he says that's no longer the case. Scholars don't even think that. He says about Matthew and John, it is not the view of the vast majority of critical historians today, and for good reason. Page 47, none of the gospel writers ever identifies himself by name or narrates any of the stories about Jesus in the first person. The gospels are all written anonymously. On page 48, he says, there are very good reasons for thinking that both he, referring to Luke, or the author of Luke, and the author of Matthew, had access to a version of Mark's gospel. That means they were not independent testimony. Page 49 says, in fact, we do not have any eyewitness report of any kind about Jesus written in his own day. Then he talks about non-Christian sources, and he says on page 51, the first surviving reference to Jesus by a non-Christian, non-Jewish source of any kind appears in the writings of Pliny the Younger. On page 52, he quotes what Pliny says, that these people sing hymns to Christ as to God. And that's all he says about Jesus. The Christians worshiped him by singing to him. He does not, as you can see, even call him Jesus, but instead uses his most common epithet, Christ. He says on page 52, this reference is obviously not much to go on, but it does tell us that there were Christians worshiping someone named Christ in the early 2nd century. Then he talks about Suetonius on page 53. He says, even less helpful is a reference found in the writings of the Roman biographer Suetonius. In Suetonius's biography of Claudius, the emperor of Rome from 41 to 54 CE, Suetonius indicates that at one point in his reign, Claudius deported all the Jews, not Christians, from Rome because of riots that had occurred at the instigation of Chrestus. Bart says he says nothing more about this man named Chrestus. And Christians interpret that to be a reference to Jesus, but it was after Jesus was already dead. Claudius was the emperor from 41 to 54, but Jesus was supposed to die in the 30s. So even Christians who think this is a reference to Jesus have to argue that Jesus was causing these troubles after he was already dead. It wasn't Jesus himself causing the trouble. It was people fighting over who this Christus figure was. Then Bart talks about Tacitus, the reference that Tacitus made to Jesus or Christianity in his writings, but he summarizes it this way on page 56. These three references are the only ones that survive from pagan sources within 100 years of the traditional date of Jesus' death, around the 30s. At the end of the day, I think we can discount Suetonius as too ambiguous to be of much use. Pliny is slightly more useful in showing us that Christians by the early 2nd century knew of Christ and worshipped him as divine. Tacitus is most useful of all, for his reference shows that high-ranking Roman officials of the early 2nd century knew that Jesus had lived and had been executed by the governor of Judea. And that's it. Then Bart talks about Jewish sources starting on page 56, and he says the Dead Sea Scrolls, which do not mention or allude to Jesus in any way, even though some Christians want to say it does. Then he mentions Philo from Alexandria. He says we do have the writings of an important Jewish philosopher, Philo, from the early to mid-1st century who never mentions Jesus. Then he talks about the most important Jewish reference we have, and that comes from Josephus. And he talks extensively about it because there's a lot to say about it. Bart demonstrates that he's very familiar with all the debates that scholars have had about this passage called the Testimonium Flavianum. And he takes the position that it was not an entire forgery, but that Christians manipulated it and changed it and made it look better for Christianity, even though he has no actual evidence that this is the case. It's pure speculation on his part. I believe the arguments that the Testimonium Flavianum is a complete forgery are far more convincing than Bart's arguments. Here's an interesting quote from page 65. Bart says, if by contrast the Testimonium Flavianum was not written by Josephus, we again are neither helped nor hurt in our quest to know whether Jesus lived. This is an obvious lie. If we know that Christians completely inserted Jesus into the historical record and that Josephus didn't make mention of him at all, that is highly significant, because if we knew that Christians added Jesus to Josephus and Josephus was not aware of Jesus at all, that would be a significant data point. But Bart just dismisses the idea that there's any value in finding out that Christians inserted Jesus into history. Then Bart finally talks about other rabbinic sources like the Talmud. And I don't think he accurately represents how the Talmud doesn't even mention the biblical Jesus at all, but there are Jesuses that people think might be a reference to the biblical Jesus, even though there are significant differences between them. But his concluding paragraph here is these Talmudic references to Jesus were written hundreds of years after he would have lived, and so are really of very little use for us in our quest. By the time they were set down, Christianity was a major force in the Roman Empire, and every single Christian telling stories about Jesus naturally assumed that he had really existed as a historical person. If we want evidence to support the claim that he did in fact once exist, we therefore have to turn to other sources.